The rain falls in a relentless, punishing deluge upon a nameless world that was once a paradise of grain and soil. Now it is merely another abattoir of the Imperium, a rain-slicked killing field where hope goes to bleed out and die. In the belly of the trench system, the air itself is a weapon. The atmosphere chokes the lungs with the thick, acrid stench of burnt promethium and ozone, mingling intimately with the foul rot of human excrement and unburied corpses. There is no silence to be found in this purgatory, only the constant deafening roar of basilisk artillery batteries that shake the bedrock and rattle the teeth in a soldier's skull. It is a ceaseless, rhythmic pounding that shatters eardrums and drives men mad before the enemy ever enters their sights. Beneath the deafening thunder of the guns waits the mud. This knee-deep, freezing sludge is not merely dirt and water, but a living, ravenous predator. It swallows boots, coats, and men alike, pulling them down into a cold, suffocating embrace from which many never rise. Every movement requires a titan's effort against the hungry suction of this freezing mire, leaving muscles burning and minds breaking in the dark. Guardsman Kael is but one shivering, exhausted soul trapped within this endless labyrinth of earth and agony. He clutches his standard-issue lasgun to his chest, desperately trying to keep the weapon dry while his own flesh withers in the freezing flood. He is a baseline human, a fragile vessel pushed so far past the limits of mortal exhaustion that he operates on nothing but pure terror and rote muscle memory. The Astra Militarum forces around him are slowly, methodically being ground into dust by an unseen and uncaring enemy. In the grim calculus of the 41st millennium, this is the expected and accepted outcome. The brutal, expendable nature of the Imperial Guard is dictated not by malice, but by the cold logistics of the Departamento Munitorum. To the distant scribes and calculating adepts counting the tithes on terror, a fully charged lasgun power pack holds vastly more quantifiable value than the flesh and blood of the conscript holding it. The weapon can be recharged, reassigned, and reused endlessly in the Emperor's name. The man is merely a temporary ablative shield for the sacred war gear, a transient spark destined to be extinguished in the mud. The psychological toll of such a static front line breaks the human spirit long before the body finally yields. Chroniclers and data savants might compare this localized slaughter to the legendary attrition of the Siege of Vrax or the apocalyptic meat grinders of Krieg's toxic past, but such comparisons fall pitifully short. This is that primordial nightmare scaled to a galactic, hopeless extreme, where whole generations are born and die in the exact same blood-soaked trench without ever seeing a single yard of ground gained. Kyle breathes in the toxic mist and attempts to shift his weight against the crumbling earthen wall. The freezing mud clings to him with a jealous, unyielding strength, resisting his pathetic struggle to simply stand upright. He pushes harder against the mire, expecting the familiar burning ache of fatigued muscles protesting the sudden motion. Instead, a profound and horrifying numbness washes over his frayed mind as a brand new terror takes hold. He stares down blindly into the dark, swirling waters of the flooded trench, coming to the agonizing realization that he can no longer feel his lower extremities at all. The ceaseless drum of the artillery above fades into a dull throb as Kyle huddles within the claustrophobic damp of his dugout. His trembling hands reach for the mud-caked laces of his standard-issue combat boot. For weeks, this hardened plasteel and leather casing has been his only defense against the toxic mire of the trench. Now it is a tomb. As he peels the stiff material away from his calf, the vacuum seal breaks with a sickening suction. The stench hits him instantly. It is the unmistakable cloying odor of rot. A putrid miasma of dead flesh has been slowly liquefying inside a waterproof prison. Kyle stares in abject horror at the ruin of his own limb. The skin is deathly pale and heavily macerated. It wrinkles and sloughs off like wet parchment under the slightest touch. His toes are engorged and utterly blackened. They have been consumed by the creeping necrosis of severe trench foot. The blissful numbness of the freezing mud is suddenly shattered. As the restrictive pressure of the boot is removed, arterial blood attempts to force its way back into the ruined necrotic capillaries. The resulting sensation is not warmth, but a waking, fiery agony. It is 1,000 rusted needles driving into his nerve endings all at once. He bites his own lip until it bleeds to keep from screaming. To cry out for help in a low-priority sector is a fool's errand. The Departamento Ministorum does not waste precious Medicae resources on the expendable meat of the outer defense lines. In the grim calculus of the Imperial Guard, the rules of triage are absolute and unforgiving. If a guardsman cannot hold a lasgun and hold the line, he is no longer a soldier. He is dead weight. He is nothing more than an unauthorized consumer of rations and oxygen. Even if Kael were to drag himself through the flooded communication trenches to a regimental aid post, his salvation would be just as horrific as the rot. The rigid Officio Medicae triage protocol for advancing gangrene on static front lines is immediate and unceremonious amputation. The regiment's meagre supply of anesthetics has long since been exhausted, leaving nothing for the expendable infantry. If a field chirurgeon is even present, the corrupted flesh is simply severed with a rusted, blood-stained bone saw. The stump is then brutally cauterized with the overheated barrel of a las pistol or a red-hot iron. More often the afflicted are simply left to the mercy of the god emperor. They are given a final prayer and a single last blast to the temple if a commissar is feeling particularly charitable. Kael realizes with crushing clarity that his end will not come in a glorious charge against the enemies of mankind. There will be no heroic sacrifice to be remembered. There will be no statues raised in his name and no litanies sung for his valor. He is dying a pathetic and slow death in a lightless hole. He is being consumed by the very earth he was sworn to defend. The blackness in his toes seems to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. Unseen by the naked eye, the virulent pathogens bred in the corpse-choked mud are breaching the final barriers of his immune system. The necrotic rot penetrates his veins. It spills a lethal tide of bacterial poison directly into his bloodstream. A sudden and violent shudder racks his frail body as his core temperature begins to spike. The freezing damp of the dugout is replaced by a suffocating internal inferno. The rot does not remain confined to his ruined leg. The black veins of necrosis creep upward, carrying the foulness of the trench directly into his bloodstream. Septicemia takes hold of him with the grip of a merciless executioner. Kael is seized by violent shivering, his teeth clattering against each other as an unnatural cold settles deep within his marrow. A cloying, freezing sweat coats his grime-smeared face. Beneath his ribs, his heart races in a desperate, fluttering rhythm, a failing engine trying to pump poison through a dying vessel. Reality itself begins to tear at the seams. The mud walls of the trench breathe and pulse in his fevered vision. He calls out, his voice a pathetic, rasping plea for salvation. No one answers. A sudden mortar strike further down the trench line reduces half of his remaining squad to pulverized bone and shredded flak armor. Those few who survive sit slumped against the dirt, their eyes hollow and vacant. They are too thoroughly shattered by the endless slaughter to even register his cries. He is entirely alone. The galaxy spans 1,000,000 worlds. The Emperor sits upon a throne of gold as a living god, and Guardsman Kael is nothing more than a dying speck sinking into the indifferent mud. There is a terrible truth hidden beneath the vaulted arches of the Ministorum and the triumphant hymns of Imperial propaganda. While the glorious Adeptus Astartes clash with Xenos abominations and demonic princes within burning drop zones and void-locked macro-cathedrals, the true foundation of the Imperium is built upon mundane, undignified death. For every hero who falls with a bolter in hand, 1,000,000,000 unnamed souls perish from the simple, quiet horrors of existence. They die from untreated infections, from the slow decay of malnutrition, and from the biting agony of total exposure. The Administratum does not record the names of those who succumb to a sip of tainted water or a scrape from rusted iron. There is no mythic glory to be found here in the filth. There is only the vile, agonizing reality of a human body breaking down into the very dirt it was ordered to defend. The grand tapestry of the Emperor's realm is woven from the rotting flesh of countless men like Kael, men who die weeping in the dark without a single foe in sight. His fever dreams deepen as the pale, choked sun finally sinks beneath the horizon. Night claims the battlefield, bringing with it a profound and terrifying shift. The relentless, earth-shaking thunder of the enemy artillery abruptly ceases. The sudden absence of the barrage creates a deafening silence that presses down upon the trench like a physical weight. Nothing remains but the chilling wind and the wet, wretched sound of Kael whimpering into the soil. He waits for his failing heart to finally give out in the blackness. Instead, from the deep shadows of the ruined wastes, a new and entirely strange noise begins to rise. The fever burns away the last remnants of Guardsman Kael's sanity. The sepsis in his blood has become a localized hell, an inferno of infection radiating from his shattered flesh into the deepest recesses of his mind. He is completely alone in the stagnant water of the flooded dugout, left only with the agonizing throb of his own dying heartbeat. Flesh and spirit can only endure a finite measure of suffering before they inevitably shatter. Kael reaches that absolute zenith of pain. With trembling, necrotic fingers, he presses the cold muzzle of his standard-issue lasgun beneath his chin. The plasteel barrel rests heavily against his throat, offering the only salvation left to a forgotten soldier on a forsaken world. He closes his weeping eyes and sends a desperate, silent scream into the void. He prays to the God-Emperor of mankind, begging the Golden Throne for deliverance. He asks for a miracle of sudden healing, or, barring that impossibility, just a fleeting moment of courage to pull the trigger and end the nightmare. No angels of death descend from the weeping heavens. No golden light pierces the gloom of the suffocating trench. There is only silence. The absence of the Emperor is palpable, a crushing, heavy weight that presses down upon his soul and extinguishes his final spark of hope. He has been truly abandoned by his species and his silent god. The true peril of such absolute despair lies within the predatory nature of the Imperium. The warp is not merely a parallel dimension of chaotic energy, but a dark mirror reflecting the emotional turbulence of all sentient life. Every joy, every terror, and every sorrow bleeds through the veil of reality to stir the tides of the Empyrean. When a human soul experiences absolute concentrated misery, the resonance it casts into the warp is unimaginably bright. Feelings of utter abandonment and profound physical agony do not simply dissipate into the ether. They coalesce, forming a psychic beacon that cuts through the tempest of the Sea of Souls. Entities of pure malice, lurking just behind the fragile fabric of the material universe, hunger endlessly for such raw, unfiltered despair. By surrendering entirely to his torment, Kael's broken spirit ignites a blinding flare in the Empyrean, drawing the hungering gaze of the ruinous powers. His concentrated misery acts as a blinding lighthouse, drawing demonic predators from the deepest abysses of the archenemy. The veil of reality grows perilously thin around the dying guardsman. Unseen horrors gather at the edges of his fading perception, eager to feast upon his fractured essence the moment his mortal life is extinguished. Kael does not know of the ethereal audience salivating over his impending demise. He knows only the unbearable heat of his infected wounds and the cold promise of the weapon in his hands. He takes one final ragged breath of the putrid air. He awkwardly stretches his trembling thumb down toward the trigger guard, the firing mechanism groaning under the lethal pressure. The blinding release of death is only a heartbeat away. Yet before his finger can fully squeeze the trigger, a distinct, impossibly loud buzzing sound violently breaks his concentration. The lasgun trembled in his failing grip, the muzzle drifting away from beneath his chin as the salvation of a sudden death was stolen by a singular wet vibration. From the stagnant air of the trench descended a solitary blowfly, abnormally large and glistening with an oily, iridescent green sheen. It alighted upon the festering ruin of Kael's blackened, necrotic foot. This was no simple scavenger of the battlefield, but a creature of deliberate and horrific majesty. Its multifaceted compound eyes swirled with microscopic shifting galaxies of disease. A segmented proboscis uncoiled from its mandibles, twitching with unnatural eagerness as it tasted the weeping sores and the rotting meat of the guardsman. The beat of its membranous wings produced a heavy, viscous rhythm, displacing the air with a noise like tearing meat and churning sludge. Kael found himself paralyzed, his finger completely slack upon the trigger, his mind captivated by the impossible behavior of the carrion insect. As it fed, the relentless droning of its wings began to shift and modulate. The low vibration twisted through the damp air, forming impossible syllables that coalesced into a morbid, comforting lullaby whispered directly into Kael's fevered brain. In the vast and decaying tapestry of the warp, the fly is a sacred vessel of the plague god. Where the Adeptus Terra venerates golden-winged cherubim forged of sanctified flesh and steel to bear the missives of the Emperor, Nurgle employs the lowliest, most repulsive vermin as his holy angels. These bloated, disease-carrying insects are the true heralds of his boundless affection. They are born from the festering depths of the plague garden, an endless, rotting domain of pestilence and demon flies that sprawls outward from the Lord of Decay's manse within the realm of chaos. To the uninitiated, the fly is merely a harbinger of rot, a vile thing to be swatted and despised. But to those embraced by the Grandfather, the fly is a ministering spirit. It is the vector through which the ultimate terminal truth is delivered to a suffering galaxy. The Imperium promises salvation through glorious martyrdom and unyielding pain, yet Nurgle offers immediate relief, using these creeping, crawling messengers to kiss away the agony of his children and inoculate them with his eternal gifts. The cherub sings of duty, but the fly hums of rest. That same gentle hum now wrapped around Kael, soothing the jagged edges of his terror. The solitary drone of the iridescent herald grew louder, echoing through the desolate silence of the mud. It was no longer alone. The shadows of the trench began to shift and writhe as the singular vibration multiplied by the dozens, then the hundreds, then the thousands. A suffocating blanket of winged bodies descended from the toxic mist, drawn by the song of the first arrival. The sheer volume of their collective droning became a physical force, pressing against Kael's skull and wrapping his consciousness in a thick, narcotic haze. The drone of the solitary fly expands, swelling into a deafening chorus that shatters the fragile boundary between the physical universe and the immaterium. The muddy, blood-soaked walls of the trench begin to soften and bleed, melting away like wax beneath a blazing sun. In their place, a miraculous and terrifying vista unfolds before Kael's fever-clouded eyes. He is no longer freezing in the hellish bombardment of a forgotten siege. He has been transported to a vibrant, impossible sanctuary. This is a garden of staggering proportions, overgrown with a riotous, sickening abundance of flora. Great weeping willows bow their heavy branches toward the earth, dripping thick, amber droplets of foul-smelling pus instead of morning dew. Vast beds of swollen, bruised flowers burst into bloom, their roots firmly tangled within the eye sockets of grinning, moss-covered skulls. Instead of trench water choked with the dead, rivers of thick, warm sludge meander through the emerald rot, bubbling with a soothing, rhythmic warmth. Kael's mind, fracturing beneath the weight of trauma and infection, wholly detaches from the brutal reality of his service. He sees not a nightmare, but a haven. To understand this hallucination is to understand the greatest paradox of the ruinous powers. Deep within the churning madness of the warp lies the Garden of Nurgle. It is a realm defined by a twisted, sickening duality. On one hand, it is the ultimate manifestation of death, disease, and inevitable decay. Yet on the other hand, it is a place of hyperabundant, unchecked life. Where the Imperium sees only necrosis and plague, the plague god sees glorious rebirth and microscopic ecosystems flourishing in the rot. Life feeds upon death in an endless, exuberant cycle of fecundity. Of all the dominions claimed by the dark gods, only the Garden of Nurgle can truly be described as peaceful. There is no raging bloodlust here, no labyrinthine deceit, and no agonizing pursuit of excess. There is only the quiet, inevitable embrace of entropy, wrapped in the guise of a loving harvest. As Kael wanders deeper into this hallucinatory paradise, the maddening buzz in his ears shifts, resolving at last into a distinct and coherent presence. It is not a voice of monstrous terror, nor a booming command from a callous officer. It is a warm, jovial murmur, rich with an intensely grandfatherly affection. The voice does not threaten the young soldier. Instead, it wraps around him like a heavy, comforting blanket, expressing profound pity for his ceaseless torment. It weeps for his frozen limbs, his starving belly, and his shattered nerves. The unseen patriarch whispers sweet validations into the crumbling ruins of Kael's mind, acknowledging every unspoken grievance the boy has ever harbored. The soothing entity begins to gently probe the darkest corners of his soul, asking why such a loyal son has been left to rot in the mud by a silent emperor who demands everything and offers nothing in return. The perfumed rot of the garden settles deep into Kael's lungs, bringing an intoxicating, impossible peace. A voice speaks to him, not in the booming thunder of a warlord, but in the tender, rumbling whisper of a doting patriarch. It asks him a simple, devastating question. It asks why he must suffer for a silent master. The Emperor of mankind sits upon a throne of gold, demanding a diet of endless sacrifice, billions of souls fed into the grinding machinery of a decaying empire. This corpse god offers no comfort to the dying, no reprieve to the exhausted, only the cold command to bleed until the body is an empty husk. The voice within the garden points out this agonizing truth with boundless empathy. It asks Kael to look at his own ruined flesh, at his discarded humanity, and realize that he has been thrown away by the very Imperium he swore to protect. There is a living God who loves him exactly as he is, broken, rotting, and discarded. This is the true, insidious seduction of the plague god. Nurgle does not conquer through sheer martial might, but by exploiting the deepest, most vulnerable facets of the mortal condition. In the darkest, most forbidden grimoires of the Inquisition, he is often described as the most intimately human of the ruinous powers. Consider his brothers in the Great Game. Khorne demands unending fury and physical prowess, a taxing devotion of eternal slaughter. Tzeentch requires exhausting ambition, a labyrinth of paranoia and constant scheming evolution. Slaanesh drives its followers to the breaking point of sensation, demanding a relentless pursuit of excess that ultimately consumes the mind. They all demand that the mortal strives, fights, and hungers. Nurgle alone asks for nothing. He feeds upon despair, upon the innate, overwhelming human desire to simply be free from pain. He does not ask his children to be strong or beautiful or victorious. He only asks them to stop fighting. He invites them to surrender, to give up the exhausting struggle against the inevitable decay of all things, and be embraced exactly as they are. To Nurgle, the sick, the broken, and the dying are beautiful. He is the grandfather, and his love is unconditional, rooted in the shared stagnation of the grave. This gentle logic flows into Kael's mind like warm honey. His lifelong indoctrination into the Imperial cult begins to fracture under the sheer, crushing weight of his own exhaustion. The litanies of hatred and resilience that have guided his every waking moment seem suddenly hollow, replaced by the profound promise of relief. The voice assures him that the pain can end forever, right now, if he will only accept the gift of stagnation. He feels the heavy burden of duty lifting from his shattered shoulders. He is ready to close his eyes and sink into the loving rot of the garden. Then reality violently asserts its claim. A blinding, jagged spike of physical agony rips through his nervous system as his real body, buried in the filth of the trench, begins to shut down. The shockwave of pain tears the peaceful illusion away, dragging his consciousness back into the freezing mud and the stench of his own gangrenous wounds. He is awake once more in the slaughterhouse of the material universe, staring into the dark with a terrible choice looming before him. The golden illusion shatters like brittle glass, violently hurling Kael back into the unforgiving reality of the freezing mud. The phantom warmth is replaced instantly by the biting chill of the trench. His gangrenous leg throbs with an agony so absolute that it bleaches his vision entirely white. His nervous system is drowning in a sea of torment. Amidst this symphony of physical collapse, the voice returns. It does not command him with the roaring fury of the blood god, nor does it weave the dizzying labyrinths of the architect of fate. Instead, it whispers with the terrifying gentleness of a doting patriarch. It asks a simple, polite question. Let me take the pain away, my child, just say yes. To understand the true horror of the arch-enemy is to understand the mechanics of spiritual decay. The preachers of the Ministorum often teach that corruption is a violent invasion, a forcible defilement of the pure soul by the predations of the warp. While it is true that exposure to the immaterium can mutate flesh and fracture minds against a victim's will, the most enduring bonds forged with the ruinous powers require something far more tragic. They require genuine, willing surrender. This is especially true of the plague god. Nurgle does not merely wish to dominate his subjects, for domination breeds resentment, and resentment is a catalyst for change. Nurgle desires stasis, and stasis is born from absolute acceptance. He wants his children to love him. He wants them to embrace his gifts with open arms. The deepest, most inescapable damnations are not those forced upon a struggling soul, but those invited across the threshold. The tragic irony of this transaction is profound. Though the Imperial creed demands absolute, unquestioning obedience, the cruelest irony of the human soul is its inherent capacity to choose its own damnation. Yet it is this very free will that Kael must exercise to condemn his own soul forever. He is not a victim of a warp breach, nor is he a sacrifice offered upon an altar by a deranged cultist. He is an Imperial guardsman dying alone in the dark, being offered a choice. The unbearable weight of his suffering has eroded his faith, leaving only the primal, desperate desire for relief. Kael's trembling hands finally surrender their desperate grip. His issued Lasgun, the very symbol of his duty to the Golden Throne, slips from his numb fingers and sinks into the contaminated muck. Hot tears well up in his bloodshot eyes, streaking down his filthy face to cut trails through layers of ash and dried blood. He is completely and utterly broken. The pain has scoured away his pride, his memories of home, and his loyalty to a distant god-emperor who remains entirely silent to his prayers. Gathering the final shred of his autonomy, Kael looks into the churning void of his own despair. He parts his cracked, bleeding lips. With a single, exhausted exhalation, he whispers his consent to the darkness. Yes, in the exact fraction of a heartbeat that follows that solitary word, the blinding agony in his shattered body vanishes completely. The very instant the syllable of surrender left his blistered lips, the universe went utterly and beautifully silent. The blinding, white-hot agony that had chewed through Kael's shattered leg for weeks ceased in a singular heartbeat. It did not fade or diminish. It was annihilated. In its place rushed a profound, staggering wave of pure euphoria that struck him with the force of an artillery shell. It was a sensation akin to a massive, lethal dose of medici-grade calmer flooding a starved brain, yet entirely unclouded by mundane lethargy. A warm, golden light seemed to ignite deep within the cavern of his chest, radiating outward through his shivering veins. For the first time since his deployment to this forsaken mudball, Kael felt an overwhelming supernatural sense of love, safety, and absolute peace. He was swaddled in a cosmic embrace that defied the horrors of the materium. The contrast was as grotesque as it was tragic. Outside the shell crater, the grim darkness of the unending war raged on beneath skies choked with toxic ash, but inside Kael's mind, he walked in sunlit fields of total serenity. To understand the true horror of the plague god is to look beyond the festering boils and the weeping sores. The blessings of Nurgle, particularly the gifts akin to the rot, are not merely physical diseases. They are spiritual anesthetics of the highest and most insidious order. The grandfather does not simply inflict decay upon his children. He fundamentally alters a mortal's nervous system and rewrites the very architecture of their soul. The agonizing signals of necrotizing flesh, failing organs and snapping bone are intercepted and transmuted into sensations of intense warmth and sublime comfort. The victim's mind is violently detached from the reality of their physical degradation. They feel entirely whole, entirely cleansed and entirely cured, even as their bodies dissolve into liquid putrescence. The rot becomes a blanket. The flies become a chorus of angels. This is the ultimate cruelty of the ruinous powers, wrapping damnation in the guise of salvation. Kael wept tears of pure, unadulterated joy as the golden silence washed away the mud, the blood, and the terror of the trenches. The crushing despair that had broken his spirit evaporated like morning mist under a blazing sun. His mind was no longer his own, yet he had never felt more liberated. He looked down at his ruined leg, no longer seeing a festering wound, but a sacred vessel of his Saviour's affection. The phantom warmth surged down into his deadened muscles, promising a strength he thought lost forever. Intoxicated by this divine cessation of pain and emboldened by the miraculous vigor coursing through his infected veins, Kael placed his trembling hands against the slick mud. He drew a deep, rattling breath of the poisonous air, finding it sweet as honey, and pushed downward to do something he had not done in weeks. He prepared to stand. He rises from the corrupted earth, an ignorant child, taking his first steps into a garden of profound agony. His foot, now a gruesome mass of black and sloughing flesh, presses deeply into a stagnant puddle of acidic mud and rusted razor wire. The jagged metal barbs slice through his decaying instep, grinding directly against the exposed bone. He does not wince. Instead, a serene and terrifying smile stretches across his cracked lips. Kael flexes his rotting toes in the toxic sludge. The physical reality of his movement is a grotesque symphony of anatomical ruin. Necrotic tendons stretch far past their natural breaking point, snapping and popping with the sickening resonance of dry twigs crushed under a heavy iron boot. Putrefied ligaments tear away from softening joints, while dead muscle fibers dissolve into dark, weeping slurry. Yet within the shattered remnants of Kael's mind, this catastrophic physical failure translates as pure relief. To his infected consciousness, the horrific tearing of his own dying flesh feels exactly like the deeply satisfying stretch of a man waking from a long, restful slumber. He lifts his trembling hands to his face. The skin of his fingers is rapidly blooming into a deep, bruised purple as his circulatory system fails and the blood stagnates in his veins. He gazes upon the spreading discoloration and weeps, finding the necrotic hues to be a display of breathtaking beauty. It is vital to comprehend the sheer, undeniable horror of physiological hijacking orchestrated by the ruinous powers. When a mortal vessel receives the gifts of the plague god, their biological reality is entirely conquered and overwritten by the Imperium. Under the laws of nature, the human body would succumb instantly to toxic shock, massive hemorrhage, and cascading organ failure. Chaos does not permit such a merciful release. Foul warp energies flood the rotting vessel, forcibly sustaining biological functions that have logically and medically ceased. This unholy symbiosis explains how Nurgle's endless legions can march relentlessly across 1,000 war-torn worlds. They walk with casually severed limbs, with their abdomens split open, and with their vital organs completely missing. They do not collapse because their biology is no longer the engine of their existence. The raw stuff of the warp animates what biology has completely abandoned. The Immaterium operates the dead tissue as a macabre puppet, replacing the need for a beating heart with the sustaining power of divine stagnation. Kael breathes deeply, filling his fluid-logged lungs with the suffocating stench of trench rot. The agony of his mortality has been permanently burned away by the stagnant warmth of his dark saviour. Slowly, he turns his heavy, mutating head to look out across the churned ruin of the battlefield. The war-torn wasteland of corpses and craters no longer registers as a place of slaughter and despair. His vision has been fundamentally and irrevocably altered by his new patron. Kael lifted his foot to the wooden planks of the fire step, feeling an Xenos lightness in his rotting limbs. He hauled himself upward, his head rising above the ruined parapet to gaze out upon the vast expanse of no man's land. What met his eyes was not the apocalyptic hellscape of mud, craters, and unending slaughter that had defined his waking nightmares for months. The foul alchemy of the warp had drawn a veil over his mortal senses, rewriting his perception of reality with terrifying completeness. The endless coils of rusted, blood-soaked barbed wire that choked the battlefield no longer resembled instruments of agonizing entrapment. To Kael, they were lush, verdant vines, bursting with magnificent blooming briars of the deepest, most vibrant crimson. The choking clouds of corrosive chemgas, which only moments ago would have dissolved his lungs into bloody froth, now drifted across the torn earth as a sweet, luminous morning mist. He breathed it in deeply, tasting only the fragrant dew of a pristine dawn. Beneath this ethereal haze lay the shattered remains of his fallen regiment, their dismembered and bloated corpses scattered among the craters. Yet Kael did not see the mutilated dead. Through the rose-tinted visor of his corruption, he saw his beloved brothers in arms resting peacefully on soft fields of green. He smiled at them, believing they were merely slumbering after a grand and joyous feast, their faces completely serene under the gentle caress of a loving sun. Herein lies the true, insidious horror of the plague god. The radical savants of the Ordo Sepulturum know well the cognitive dissonance that binds the followers of Nurgle. They are not the shambling, mindless automata that Imperial propaganda so often depicts. They are beings of profound, overflowing joy, cursed to perceive the universe entirely backwards. To the baseline human, disease and decay are the ultimate horrors, the harbingers of agonizing ends. To the corrupted, this entropy is revealed as the most beautiful cycle of life, a boundless garden of rebirth where every rotting lesion is a blossoming flower. Their madness is not born of shrieking terror, but of absolute serene acceptance. They find a grotesque harmony in the carnage, wrapped in a psychic delusion so powerful that it shields them from the reality of their own putrefaction. It is a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, for their happiness is entirely genuine. Kael stood in the midst of a slaughterhouse, his soul weeping with profound gratitude for the beauty he beheld. His heart, swollen with necrotic fluids, swelled instead with an unbearable love. He looked down at his own ravaged hands, then out to the sleeping forms of his brothers, and finally toward the winding trenches where the rest of his suffering regiment still huddled in darkness. A profound sense of pity washed over him. They were still trapped in the world of pain, blind to the paradise that now surrounded them. With a trembling, euphoric breath, Kael knew what he had to do. He could not keep this miraculous salvation to himself. Guardsman Kael steps forward into the mud of the trench line, but he no longer cowers from the wrath of the heavens. Where once he scrambled on his belly like terrified vermin, he now walks upright with the serene grace of a holy pilgrim. The earth-shattering concussions of enemy artillery no longer register as threats to his ruined mind. To his enlightened eyes, the blinding flashes of high explosives are magnificent fireworks, joyous illuminations cast across the sky to celebrate his sudden salvation. A gentle, beatific smile graces his soot-stained face as he wanders through the absolute hell of the front line. He feels utterly holy. He feels chosen by a benevolent and loving God, bathed in a profound peace that transcends the slaughter around him. To understand the true horror of the arch-enemy, one must understand how the seeds of corruption find fertile soil. The cults of the ruinous powers take many forms across the million worlds of the Imperium. The blood god Khorne draws his followers from the fighting pits and the battlefields, exploiting righteous vengeance and the sheer lust for martial power. The dark prince Slaanesh preys upon the bored and the beautiful, twisting the desire for perfection into depraved hedonism. But the plague god Nurgle is vastly, terribly different. Cults dedicated to the Lord of Decay do not often begin in shadowy cabals or blood-drenched temples. They are born in overflowing medici tents, in desperate hospices, and within the suffocating squalor of underhive slums. They begin among those who simply wish to heal the sick, or among the dying who beg for an end to their agonizing pain. Nurgle hears these desperate prayers and answers them with an awful, boundless generosity. He removes the pain, replacing it with joyous acceptance of disease. The road to his wretched embrace is almost always paved with the absolute best of intentions. It is this exact, twisted compassion that now fills Kael to the very brim of his soul. He looks upon his fellow soldiers shivering in the muck and feels only overwhelming pity for their profound ignorance. They are trapped in a cycle of fear and agony, blind to the magnificent garden that has blossomed around them. Kael burns with the desperate need to save his squadmates from their relentless torment. He wants to share his newfound faith, to show them the glorious truth of the decay that brings eternal peace. As he moves to spread this joyous revelation, his dark devotion demands a physical vessel worthy of such a profound blessing. With every serene step he takes down the shattered duckboards, the foul miracles within his bloodstream begin to work with terrifying speed. The gifts of the plague god are impatient, and the fragile human shell of Guardsman Kael prepares to undergo a sudden and violent metamorphosis. As Kael moved through the flooded arteries of the trench network, the miraculous mending of his flesh accelerated into something far more grotesque. The grand design of his unseen benefactor did not merely restore what was lost, it demanded absolute proliferation. His mortal shell began to overproduce life with a staggering, unchecked violence. Bulbous tumours erupted in rapid succession along his jawline and down the tendons of his neck. The skin stretched taut over these sudden growths, straining the fragile limits of human anatomy. Yet to Kael, imprisoned within his euphoric delusion, this hideous swelling did not bring agony. Instead, the suffocating mass of buboes felt only like the warm, heavy embrace of a thick blanket wrapped around his shivering shoulders. He smiled through the mutation, a blissful thrall wandering a garden of unseen delights. His complexion darkened into a bruised, necrotic tapestry of virulent green and swollen purple. From the stretched pores of his agonizingly tight skin, a thick fluid began to weep. It did not carry the metallic tang of blood or the foul stench of ordinary rot. It smelled overwhelmingly sweet, like overripe fruit left to ferment in the humid heat of a forgotten harvest. The sickening chorus of his metamorphosis was undeniable. Wet, tearing noises echoed from his very musculature as bone and sinew shifted to accommodate the unnatural bulk. The tough synthweave of his Ministorum issue fatigues, designed to withstand the rigors of trench warfare, began to rip at the seams with sharp snaps. Herein lies the darkest paradox of the plague god. Mortal scholars of the Officio Medicae understand disease as a pure agent of destruction, a biological invader that starves and kills the host until nothing remains. The gifts of Nurgle operate upon a far more terrifying paradigm. His afflictions are characterized by an absolute chaotic overabundance of life. It is a monstrous hypervitality where the host does not simply wither and perish. Instead, the invading viruses, the ancient bacteria, and the victim's own mutating cells replicate endlessly in a state of horrific, symbiotic harmony. Every microorganism is fed, every parasitic worm is nurtured, and the human body is transformed into a thriving, self-sustaining ecosystem of boundless rot. True death is banished, replaced by a grotesque immortality fueled by perpetual agonizing gestation. Kael was no longer merely a guardsman, but a walking cathedral of this infinite bounty. His bloated limbs swung with a ponderous, heavy grace as the rampant hypertrophy consumed his original silhouette. He grew wider, denser, and far more terrible as the rampant cellular generation continued unabated. The relentless expansion of his inner organs began to push against the unyielding cage of his ribs. Trapped within his chest cavity, the seething mass of new, corrupt life found itself entirely devoid of space. A terrible tension took hold of his frame, driven by the furious biology multiplying within him. The internal pressure grew exponentially with every stumbling step he took through the muck. Deep beneath the weeping layers of his bruised skin, the unimaginable pressure building inside his torso reached a catastrophic, trembling threshold. The unbearable pressure mounting within the guardsman finally reaches its grisly apex. The dense weave of his Imperial flak armor groans before buckling under the sheer mass of his distended belly. With a sickening, wet tearing of flesh, Kael's swollen stomach splits wide open along its equator. A torrential cascade of bloated, writhing intestines spills forth into the humid air. These are no longer the pale organs of a mortal man. They are a multicolored tapestry of necrosis and rebirth, mottled with bruising purples, sickly greens, and deep, necrotic blacks. The heavy loops of gut uncoil like fat, blind serpents, dropping lower and lower until they brush against Kael's armored knees. By all laws of mortal biology, a shock of this magnitude should trigger immediate cardiac arrest or prompt blood-curdling screams of agony. Yet Kael utters no sound of distress. Instead, his trembling hands reach down to gently catch the cascading mass of his own bowels. He cradles the heavy, steaming coils with an eerie, profound tenderness. His calloused fingers stroke the exposed, pulsating viscera lovingly, touching the slick membranes as if calming a restless newborn pet. He bows his head, murmuring soft, gurgling words of endearment to the thick, pale parasites that squirm and burrow within his own exposed digestive tract. To witness such an atrocity is to glimpse the foundational philosophy of the plague god. This signature disembowelment is a sacred milestone for the followers of Nurgle, most infamously observed among the dreaded plague marines of the Death Guard. To the uninitiated mind, an eviscerated warrior is a dead warrior, but the Grandfather's gifts rewrite the very laws of biology. When a chosen vessel splits open to reveal their innards, those exposed organs instantly become immune to conventional infection or the debilitating shocks of mortal pain. They cease to function merely as processes of sustenance and instead evolve into complex, localized sensory organs. The dangling, rotted intestines taste the chemical composition of the battlefield air, savoring fear, smoke, and rot with equal delight. They breathe in the corruption of the environment and exhale a choking miasma, functioning as fleshy sensors that spread holy spores across the blighted earth. This horrific spilling of the self is the ultimate expression of Nurgle's dogma. It is the literal and spiritual act of a mortal opening up to the universe, offering their deepest, most vulnerable core to be touched by the unending cycle of decay and monstrous rebirth. The flesh is no longer a prison meant to seal the soul away from the world. It is an open garden, welcoming all manner of fly, maggot, and viral bloom to take root within its fertile loam. Kael stands completely serene, a mortal man acting as a living shrine to entropy, as the heavy weight of his exposed intestines hangs from his grasp. The teeming ecosystem within his ruined belly continues to pulse with an unnatural, sickening vitality. Yet the metamorphosis is far from complete, as the monumental mass of his new internal biology requires a foundation capable of bearing such unholy abundance. Deep beneath his tearing skin, a new, agonizing symphony of transformation begins to echo. The dense calcium of his mortal framework prepares to shatter and reform. The rot that had split Kael's belly now drove its tendrils into the deepest marrow of his skeleton. Within the span of a few ragged breaths, his human framework began to crack and dissolve, melting into a cartilaginous slurry before violently reforming. His ribcage snapped outward with brutal force. The pale bones elongated with agonizing speed, ripping through his greying skin to interlock in a macabre exterior cage. This grotesque cradle now securely held his spilling, swollen organs in place, a morbid display of unnatural anatomy that defied all medical reason. From his trembling shoulders and the dome of his forehead hardened nodules of calcified pus and dense keratin erupted into the stale air. These vile extrusions twisted and fused, rapidly growing into jagged, asymmetrical horns that wept continuously with infected marrow. His jaw gave way, unhinging entirely to accommodate a blackened, necrotic tongue that swelled to the vast proportions of a severed limb. The chamber was thick with the wet, grinding noises of calcium shearing against cartilage and flesh tearing under the pressure of forced growth. Yet cutting through this symphony of bodily desecration was a sound far more chilling than the tearing of meat. Kael was humming. It was a cheerful, rhythmic tune, utterly devoid of pain, echoing from the depths of his ruptured throat as he happily embraced his damnation. To chronicle such a transformation is to study the terrifying biological alchemy of the warp. The transition from a fragile mortal into a bloated plague vessel, a grotesque mutant serving as a living shrine to the Grandfather, is a process of deliberate and unholy engineering. The raw stuff of chaos does not merely destroy the human frame, for the dark gods are creators as much as they are destroyers. The warp reshapes bone, keratin, and corrupted tissue to serve a divine, martial purpose. It turns mortal vulnerabilities into impervious armor and transforms natural extremities into lethal weapons. Where standard human physiology relies on a delicate internal skeleton to protect vital functions, the warp turns this paradigm inside out. Extruded bones become a formidable exterior carapace, highly resistant to massed las fire, solid slug impacts, and the hellish environments of a besieged world. The calcified growths and keratin spikes are deeply laced with supernatural diseases, ensuring that even a minor laceration inflicted by the mutant can prove instantly fatal to a loyal soldier of the Imperium. This chaotic reshaping permanently fortifies the plague vessel. It elevates a weak, perishable man into an incredibly resilient, terrifying instrument of endless war. Pain ceases to be a biological warning system, instead becoming a divine sensation that seals a holy communion with the Lord of Decay. As Kael lost the very last vestiges of his human anatomy, he grew into a towering, grotesque monument to pestilence. His massive asymmetrical form now stood completely xenos to the species he had once served. The cheerful humming vibrated through his exposed, cage-like ribs, carrying the infectious, mad joy of his patron deity. With his physical vessel entirely remade in the image of supreme rot, the barriers of mortal thought began to dissolve, just as his bones had done. The veil of reality thinned before his weeping eyes, drawing him toward a state where his entire perception of the physical universe would be forever shattered and reborn. The agony of his calcifying bones subsides, replaced by a suffocating pressure blooming behind his mortal eyes. Thick, milky cataracts bleed across his corneas, extinguishing the harsh, unforgiving light of the physical universe. Kael is plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The mundane world of shattered rock, rusted iron, and spilled blood is erased from his perception forever. Yet in this profound and sudden shadow, there is no panic to be found. As his biological sight dies and rots within his skull, a terrible inner vision violently tears itself open. It is a dark miracle born entirely of the warp. The universe is no longer rendered in the cold spectrum of natural light. Instead, Kael beholds the spectral, shimmering tapestry of the immaterium. He sees the radiant, pulsing auras of rot surrounding him. Every airborne spore, every decaying organism, every microscopic colony of devouring bacteria shines with a breathtaking, luminescent majesty. He is witnessing the endless, cyclical rhythm of death and rebirth that underpins all creation. Overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated beauty of the Grandfather's grand design, Kael begins to weep. Thick, foul-smelling sludge pours from his ruined, milk-white eyes, tracing sluggish rivers down his mutated, calcified visage. These are not tears of sorrow or regret. They are not born of the lingering pain of his forsaken humanity. They are tears of absolute, rapturous joy. Inside his twisted, corrupted mind, Kael has achieved a grotesque nirvana. He believes himself to be a creature of sublime grace, a chosen vessel of divine stagnation, standing in perfect harmony with the rotting cosmos. This is the most insidious culmination of the demonic bond. It is the final, irreversible severing of all ties to human sanity and mundane reality. The plague god is a deity of paradoxical love, showering his children with affections that rot the flesh while elevating the soul. By systematically blinding his followers to the material realm, Nurgle ensures they can never truly gaze upon their own reflections. They are mercifully spared the horrifying truth of their physical degradation. If Kael could look into a mirror and see the horned, oozing abomination he has truly become, his residual mortal mind would shatter in utter revulsion. Instead, the warp carefully filters his reality, painting his festering grotesqueries as glorious divine blessings. This engineered blindness is the ultimate mechanism of absolute control. It locks the afflicted permanently within a solipsistic delusion of warmth, purpose, and total acceptance. Nurgle's children become eternal prisoners of a twisted euphoria, entirely divorced from the monstrous reality of their own existence. The galaxy screams in terror at their foul approach, yet they hear only the joyous chiming of plague bells and the gentle whispers of a loving patriarch. Wrapped within this impenetrable cocoon of psychic delusion, Kael turns his gaze outward. His milky, dead eyes cannot see the broken earth beneath his hooves, but his newfound warp sight illuminates a familiar, desperate energy hiding in the gloom. Bright, frantic souls flicker like starving candles against the beautiful, encroaching darkness of the battlefield. Through the spectral smog of radiant decay, the newly born monster senses the terrified, racing heartbeats of his former brethren. Guided by the blinding light of his euphoric damnation, he slowly begins his inevitable march toward the trembling remnants of his Imperial Guard squad. Through the choking miasma of the ruined trench, Kael steps into the shattered enclave of his former squad. What remains of his mortal brothers is a tableau of profound and pathetic misery. Several lie broken and utterly lifeless in the cratered mud, their bodies torn apart by shrapnel. Two survivors bleed out into the stagnant water, their voices torn raw by the terror of their impending doom. They look up and see not the faithful soldier they once fought beside, but a towering monstrosity of swollen, disemboweled rot, crowned with twisting bone. Driven by pure horror, the dying men raise their lasguns with trembling hands. Crimson beams of concentrated light erupt from their weapons, scoring deep, cauterized furrows across Kael's bloated flesh. To a mortal creature, such strikes would bring blinding pain and certain death. To Kael, the searing energy registers only as a pleasant and warming caress against his corrupted bulk. He feels no anger toward their hostility. He feels only a profound and suffocating sorrow for their ignorance. His newly opened eyes perceive the brutal truth of the mortal condition. He sees the fragility of their frail flesh, the hollow futility of their desperate struggle, and the absolute cruelty of a galaxy that demands such meaningless suffering. Driven by a twisted but undeniably genuine devotion, Kael drops his massive bulk to his knees beside the closest of his dying friends. He leans over the terrified guardsman, unhinges his ruined maw, and violently expels a roaring torrent of necrotic, fly-choked sludge directly into the man's gaping wounds. This horrific act is not born of hatred. To understand the Lord of Decay is to comprehend the most tragic paradox of the Immaterium. The virulent plagues of Nurgle are almost never spread out of a desire to simply destroy or murder. They are instead distributed as a perverse and desperate form of divine charity. The transformed children of the plague god genuinely believe they are performing acts of boundless mercy. In their rotted minds, the mortal coil is nothing but an endless cycle of pain, fear, and inevitable decay. To infect a living soul with the warp-born pox is to grant them an eternal inoculation against the tragedy of normal existence. The grandfather loves his children completely and unconditionally. He wishes only to liberate them from the cold indifference of the physical universe. By sharing this grotesque contagion, Kael believes with every mutated fibre of his soul that he is curing his beloved comrade. He is offering the ultimate gift of life everlasting. He is ensuring that his brother will never again feel the bitter sting of pain or the paralyzing dread of mortality. The black and sloughing bile fills the ruined chest cavity of the screaming soldier. The deafening buzz of 1,000 plague flies drowns out the chaotic din of the battlefield. Beneath the surface of the boiling mud, the Immaterium begins to answer Kael's loving offering. The necrotic mass violently seeps into the flesh of the dead and the dying alike, weaving supernatural vitality through severed veins and shattered bone. The screaming finally ceased. The necrotic sludge expelled by Kael went to work within the ruined flesh of his former brothers. Mangled by merciless artillery and left to rot in the mud, the dead guardsmen began to twitch. Spasms of unnatural vitality seized their shattered forms. The dying friend, whose agony had echoed across the crater just moments before, fell utterly silent as the foul contagion took root in his veins. Slowly, haltingly, the fallen soldiers began to rise from the blood-stained earth. It was a resurrection born of purest blasphemy. Men with half of their skulls sheared away by shrapnel stood upright in the gloom. Soldiers missing arms and legs found balance on exposed stumps of splintered bone. Across their decaying faces stretched wide, impossible rictus grins. Their lips tore at the edges from the sheer force of their unnatural joy. When they opened their eyes, the terrible milky film of the plague god reflected Kael's own blind devotion. They lurched forward to embrace their deliverer. It was a grotesque display of familial love, a squelching mass of ruined bodies crushing together in a hideous group hug. The sound of rotten meat slapping against exposed, bloodless bone echoed in the desolate trench. Together the ruined squad began to laugh. It was a wet, rattling chorus of pure euphoria escaping from lungs filled with putrid fluid. Such is the tragic fate of those claimed by the curse of the walking pox. These walking corpses, known to the Inquisition as pox walkers, are not merely animated meat puppeted by warp sorcery. The truth of their existence is a horror far deeper and far more cruel than simple necromancy. The disease ravages the physical form, mutating the flesh and forcing the jaw into a perpetual joyous smile. Yet the original soul of the victim is not granted the mercy of true death. The consciousness remains trapped inside the rotting, smiling brain. The soldier is entirely awake, utterly aware of the atrocities their hands commit, and subjected to the agonizing sensation of their own decay. They scream silently in the prison of their own minds, completely unable to halt the terrifying, joyful dance of the corpse they inhabit. They are helpless passengers in their own damnation, forced to revel in the ruin of the Imperium they swore to protect. Kael and his reborn brothers swayed together in the muck, a perfect portrait of corrupted camaraderie. Their wet laughter carried across the battlefield, blinding them to the shifting tides of the war around them. Then the joyful reunion was suddenly eclipsed. Through the churning mud, a heavy, rhythmic thud began to shake the earth. Massive armoured footsteps approached through the fog, drowning out the wet giggles of the damned. From the swirling banks of the bilious chemfog, towering silhouettes begin to materialize. The ground shudders beneath the measured, earth-shaking tread of the Death Guard. They are the heralds of the plague god, clad in ancient Mark III power armor that has long since fused with their bloated anatomies. To look upon them is to witness the physical manifestation of entropy. Their ceramite plating is heavily pitted with millennia of deep-seated corrosion, oozing weeping rust and nameless fluids. Enormous, verdigris-choked smokestacks protrude from their broad shoulders, venting thick clouds of highly contagious pestilence into the already suffocating air. With every ponderous step, rusting bronze bells toll a discordant, mournful dirge. For any baseline human of the Imperium, this procession of shambling titans would herald the ultimate, inescapable doom. Yet in the depths of the ruined trench, there is no terror to be found. Kael and his newly resurrected flock fall to their knees in absolute grovelling reverence. They do not see monsters born of a nightmare. They see angels of decay, their true lords descending to acknowledge their ascension. The lead plague marine, a mountain of rotting majesty, pauses before the kneeling mutant. The colossal warrior leans down, the servos of his ancient armor screaming in protest beneath the layers of filth and fat. He reaches out with a massive mutated gauntlet, the ceramite stained with the blood and bile of countless campaigns. With a gentleness that entirely defies his horrific appearance, the towering giant places his heavy hand upon Kael's newly formed, bone-spurred horns. A deep, gurgling voice emanates from the rusted vox grill of the giant, a sound like bubbling mud and rattling phlegm, welcoming the lowliest mutant into the grand fold of the Legion. It is a grotesque baptism, enacted in the filth of a shattered battlefield. Here lies the profound, terrifying truth of the 14th Legion. If these wretched mutants had pledged their corrupted souls to the Iron Warriors or the Night Lords, they would be utilized as entirely expendable meat shields or tortured playthings. Most of the traitor legions view mortal cultists as nothing more than pathetic cannon fodder, cattle to be spent without a second thought in the meat grinder of the long war. The Death Guard harbour a far more insidious philosophy. Those who truly embrace the blessings of Nurgle are not merely slaves or thralls to the Lords of Barbarous. They are viewed as blessed vectors and fertile soil for the Grandfather's vast, festering garden. It is a deeply toxic, twisted camaraderie bound by shared afflictions and a mutual adoration for the cycle of decay. The transhuman Astartes and the rotting poxwalker share a grotesque communion, united by the very same diseases that course through their stagnant veins. In the shadow of the colossal plague marine, Kael experiences the ultimate validation of his heretical faith. He is no longer a forgotten conscript shivering in a lightless trench. He is a cherished child of a divine entity, welcomed into a brotherhood that transcends mortal understanding. The rotting giant withdraws his armored hand, stepping past the groveling mutants to lead them further into the glorious ruin they have wrought. Kael rises from the muck, his decaying face twisted into an expression of purest ecstasy, ready to march alongside his eternal, unyielding family. Look upon Kael now as he marches into the toxic fog. His flesh is a ruined tapestry of necrosis and weeping sores, yet a wide, unbroken smile splits his decaying face. From his shattered throat escapes a wet, gurgling hymn of praise. He walks in lockstep with the towering monstrosities of the Death Guard, a willing thrall in their unending crusade of pestilence. The tragedy of his existence is absolute and irrevocable. Kael has lost everything that tethered him to the mortal realm. His eternal soul has been devoured. His humanity has been erased from the annals of time. His mind is completely shattered, replaced entirely by the droning will of a malevolent warp entity. His body is merely a walking vessel for contagion, a vile puppet crafted from dead meat and bloated veins. He is damned for all eternity to spread unimaginable agony across the stars. He will butcher the innocent in the name of the plague god. He will choke entire worlds in viral ash and watch glorious civilizations drown in their own liquefied remains. And through every atrocity, he will never stop smiling. This is the ultimate philosophical horror of his terrible fate. Kael is completely, blissfully, and genuinely happy. The crushing burdens of terror, grief, and exhaustion have been lifted from his shoulders forever. He will never feel the searing bite of pain again. He will never cower in the suffocating shadow of fear. He will never weep for the lost or mourn the dying. In the hyper-cruel, endlessly suffering universe of the 41st millennium, this remains the most terrifying truth of all. The galaxy is an uncaring slaughterhouse of cosmic proportions. The Imperium of Man demands endless sacrifice to feed the Golden Throne, offering only blood, grinding toil, and the deafening silence of a dead god in return. Mortal existence itself is an eternity of starvation, brutal oppression, and unending warfare. In this vast, unforgiving theatre of misery, the only entity offering unconditional love is a monstrous god of horrific decay. The only force granting pure acceptance and a final end to pain is the very demonic pantheon seeking to unmake reality. To Nurgle, every suffering mortal is a cherished child waiting to be brought home. The Lord of Decay does not judge his followers. He does not demand martial perfection or dogmatic purity. He simply opens his rotting arms and welcomes the broken into his festering embrace. True happiness in this grim, dark age is never found in victory, peace, or divine salvation. True happiness is found only in the deepest, most abject damnation. Kael has finally found his ultimate peace. He is deeply and truly loved by the Grandfather. As he vanishes into the plague-choked horizon, his joyous laughter drifts back through the poisonous mist. It is the horrific sound of a universe rotting from the inside out. It is the gentle, welcoming laughter of a god who knows that, in the end, every living thing will simply surrender and smile.